Question 1. During the evaluation of a potential cost-saving measure at a Norsk hydro facility, a team identifies that implementing the measure would involve a slight deviation from established environmental reporting protocols, potentially leading to a temporary reduction in reported emissions that could be perceived favorably in the short term, but might also mask a minor, ongoing non-compliance with specific Norwegian environmental standards. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Norsk hydro team? Option A. Implement the cost-saving measure immediately, as the deviation is minor and the short-term financial benefits are significant, with a plan to rectify reporting later. Option B. Halt the implementation of the cost-saving measure and conduct a thorough review to ensure full compliance with all Norwegian environmental regulations and reporting requirements before proceeding. Option C. Proceed with the cost-saving measure, assuming that minor deviations in reporting are common practice in the industry and unlikely to attract regulatory attention. Option D. Implement the cost-saving measure and only address the reporting deviation if a formal inquiry or audit is initiated by regulatory bodies. The correct answer is A. Implement the cost-saving measure immediately, as the deviation is minor and the short-term financial benefits are significant, with a plan to rectify reporting later. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves balancing the company's immediate financial interests with its long-term ethical and regulatory obligations. Norsk Hydro, as a publicly traded company, operates under strict regulatory frameworks designed to ensure transparency, fair competition, and environmental responsibility. A decision made solely on short-term profit could lead to significant legal repercussions, reputational damage, and a loss of stakeholder trust. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing pressures. The correct approach involves prioritizing adherence to the Norwegian Public Limited Companies Act Aksjeloven and relevant environmental regulations, even if it means a short-term financial sacrifice. This approach is right because it upholds the legal and ethical standards expected of Norsk Hydro. The Norwegian Public Limited Companies Act emphasizes the duty of care and loyalty owed by directors and officers to the company and its shareholders, which includes acting in a manner that ensures long-term sustainability and compliance. Furthermore, environmental regulations in Norway are stringent, and non-compliance can result in substantial fines and operational disruptions. Acting ethically and legally, even when costly, is fundamental to maintaining Norsk Hydro's license to operate and its reputation as a responsible corporate citizen. An approach that prioritizes immediate cost savings by circumventing environmental reporting requirements is incorrect because it directly violates Norwegian environmental laws and potentially the Norwegian Public Limited Companies Act's provisions on accurate financial reporting and good corporate governance. This failure to comply with reporting obligations can lead to penalties, investigations, and damage to Norsk Hydro's credibility. An approach that focuses solely on maximizing short-term shareholder returns without considering the regulatory implications is also incorrect. While shareholder value is important, it cannot be pursued through illegal or unethical means. This approach neglects the broader responsibilities of Norsk Hydro to its stakeholders and the environment, which are legally mandated. Finally, an approach that delays addressing the environmental issue until a formal investigation is initiated is professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a reactive rather than proactive stance, which can exacerbate the problem and lead to more severe consequences. It also signals a disregard for regulatory compliance and ethical conduct, potentially exposing Norsk Hydro to greater legal and reputational risks. Professionals should use a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all relevant legal and ethical obligations. This should be followed by an assessment of the potential consequences of each course of action, considering both short-term and long-term impacts. Seeking advice from legal and compliance departments is crucial. The ultimate decision should align with the company's values and its commitment to operating within the established regulatory framework, even if it involves difficult choices. Question 2. Operational review demonstrates that a critical environmental impact report for Norsk Hydro is due within 24 hours, and preliminary data indicates a potential minor deviation from expected emission levels. The data requires further cross-referencing with a secondary sensor, which is currently offline for routine maintenance. The team is under pressure to submit the report on time. Which of the following actions best reflects a responsible and compliant approach for Norsk Hydro? Option A. Submit the report with the preliminary data, noting the potential deviation and the reason for the secondary sensor's unavailability, with a commitment to submit a corrected report once the data is verified. Option B. Proceed with reporting the preliminary data, but immediately initiate an internal investigation into why the secondary sensor was offline during a critical reporting period. Option C. Delay the submission of the report until the secondary sensor is back online and the data is fully verified, even if it means missing the initial deadline. Option D. Submit the report using the preliminary data without any mention of the potential deviation or the sensor issue, assuming the deviation is within acceptable tolerance. The correct answer is A. Submit the report with the preliminary data, noting the potential deviation and the reason for the secondary sensor's unavailability, with a commitment to submit a corrected report once the data is verified. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between immediate operational efficiency and long-term compliance with Norsk Hydro's internal policies and potentially relevant industry best practices concerning environmental reporting. The need for timely information for operational decisions must be balanced against the imperative of accurate and verifiable data submission. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the pursuit of speed does not compromise the integrity of reporting, which could have significant reputational and regulatory consequences. The correct approach involves prioritizing the verification of data before its inclusion in any official report, even if it causes a slight delay. This aligns with the principle of data integrity, a cornerstone of responsible corporate governance and ethical business conduct. Specifically, within the context of a company like Norsk Hydro, which operates in a highly regulated industry with significant environmental impact, adherence to internal control frameworks, and potentially external environmental reporting standards. Though specific regulations are not provided for this exam, the principle of accuracy is universal, is paramount. Ensuring data accuracy before reporting prevents misrepresentation, which could lead to regulatory scrutiny, fines, or damage to Norsk Hydro's reputation as a responsible operator. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with reporting the preliminary data without verification. This fails to uphold the principle of data accuracy and could lead to the dissemination of misleading information. Ethically, this is problematic, as it risks misrepresenting Norsk Hydro's environmental performance. From a compliance perspective, depending on the specific reporting requirements, which are assumed to exist for a company of this nature, submitting unverified data could constitute a breach of reporting obligations. Another incorrect approach would be to delay reporting indefinitely until absolute certainty is achieved, even for minor discrepancies. While accuracy is crucial, an overly cautious approach can hinder operational decision-making and create bottlenecks. This might not directly violate a specific regulation, but represents poor professional judgment by failing to balance competing priorities effectively. It could also lead to a failure to meet reporting deadlines if they exist, which would be a regulatory failure. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to bypass the established internal verification process altogether to expedite reporting. This undermines Norsk Hydro's internal control systems and governance structures. It represents a significant ethical lapse and a potential compliance failure, as it disregards established procedures designed to ensure accuracy and prevent errors or misconduct. Professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the reporting requirements, the potential impact of inaccurate data, and the established internal procedures for data verification. When faced with a discrepancy, the professional should first assess the materiality of the discrepancy and the urgency of the reporting. If the discrepancy is minor and the reporting is not immediately critical, a brief delay for verification is appropriate. If the discrepancy is significant or the reporting is time-sensitive, escalating the issue to a supervisor or relevant department for guidance on how to proceed while maintaining data integrity is the most prudent course of action. Question 3. Performance analysis shows that Norsk Hydro has achieved significant milestones in renewable energy production, but also experienced unexpected cost increases in its primary aluminum operations. From a stakeholder perspective, which approach best reflects responsible and compliant communication of this performance? Option A. highlight the cost increases in aluminum operations as a temporary setback, while downplaying the significance of the renewable energy production figures to avoid setting unrealistic expectations. Option B. Emphasize the renewable energy achievements and attribute cost increases to external market volatility, without detailing the specific operational factors contributing to the overruns. Option C. Present a balanced overview of both renewable energy successes and the challenges in aluminum operations, providing specific details on the causes of cost increases and outlining mitigation strategies. Option D. Focus exclusively on the positive renewable energy production figures, suggesting that these offset any concerns regarding operational costs in other divisions. The correct answer is B. Emphasize the renewable energy achievements and attribute cost increases to external market volatility, without detailing the specific operational factors contributing to the overruns. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Norsk Hydro, as a publicly traded company, operates under stringent regulatory frameworks designed to ensure transparency, fairness, and accurate financial reporting. Stakeholders, including investors, regulators, and the public, rely on the integrity of Norsk Hydro's performance analysis. Misrepresenting or selectively presenting data can lead to significant reputational damage, regulatory penalties, and loss of investor confidence. The challenge lies in balancing the need to present a positive outlook with the ethical and legal obligation to provide a complete and accurate picture of performance, adhering strictly to the Norwegian regulatory environment and any applicable international standards Norsk Hydro is bound by, such as those related to financial reporting and corporate governance. The correct approach involves a comprehensive and unbiased review of all relevant performance metrics, including both positive and negative indicators. This approach acknowledges the interconnectedness of various business functions and their impact on overall performance. By considering all aspects, Norsk Hydro can identify areas of strength to leverage and areas of weakness to address proactively. This aligns with principles of good corporate governance and ethical financial reporting, which mandate transparency and accountability. Specifically, adherence to Norwegian accounting standards, UNGAP, and relevant EU directives, as well as principles outlined by the Norwegian Securities Dealers Association, NVG for market participants, would guide this comprehensive analysis. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on positive metrics, while omitting or downplaying negative ones, constitutes a failure in transparency and potentially misleading stakeholders. This could violate regulations concerning financial disclosure and market manipulation. For instance, if Norsk Hydro were to selectively highlight production increases while ignoring significant cost overruns or environmental compliance issues, it would be a breach of its duty to provide a true and fair view. Such selective reporting can lead to regulatory scrutiny from bodies like Finanstilsynet, the Norwegian Financial Supervisory Authority, and could result in fines or other sanctions. Another incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or unsubstantiated claims, rather than rigorous data analysis, undermines the credibility of the performance assessment. This disregards the need for objective, verifiable information, which is a cornerstone of regulatory compliance and sound business practice. It also fails to meet the expectations of stakeholders who require data-driven insights for their decision-making. The professional decision-making process for Norsk Hydro in such situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Identify all relevant performance indicators, both quantitative and qualitative. 2. Gather data from all applicable sources, ensuring accuracy and completeness. 3. Analyze the data objectively, considering both favorable and unfavorable trends. 4. Consult relevant internal policies and external regulatory requirements, e.g., Norwegian Companies Act, accounting standards, stock exchange rules. 5. Prepare a balanced report that reflects the full spectrum of performance, providing context and explanations for both successes and challenges. 6. Seek internal review and, where appropriate, external assurance to ensure compliance and accuracy. Question 4. Compliance review shows that a new, more cost-effective method for waste disposal at a Norsk Hydro processing plant has been proposed by the operations team. The operations manager believes the proposed method is functionally equivalent to the current, more expensive method and will significantly reduce operational costs. However, the environmental compliance officer has raised concerns that while the new method might achieve similar immediate disposal outcomes, It has not been explicitly approved under the specific waste management permits currently held by the plant, and there is a potential for a different, albeit minor, type of effluent discharge that is not currently monitored. What is the most appropriate course of action for Norsk Hydro in this situation? Option A. Proceed with the new waste disposal method, assuming that functionally equivalent implies regulatory compliance, and inform the environmental compliance officer to monitor the new effluent for a limited period. Option B. Halt the implementation of the new waste disposal method and conduct a comprehensive assessment of its compliance with all relevant environmental regulations and permit conditions, including potential effluent impacts, before any further action is taken. Option C. Implement the new waste disposal method immediately to realize cost savings and initiate a review of the permits to seek retrospective approval if any issues arise. Option D. Defer the decision until the next scheduled permit renewal, at which point the new method can be incorporated into the updated permit application. The correct answer is C. Implement the new waste disposal method immediately to realize cost savings and initiate a review of the permits to seek retrospective approval if any issues arise. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's operational needs and its legal and ethical obligations regarding environmental impact. Norsk Hydro, as a global industrial company, operates under stringent environmental regulations designed to protect ecosystems and public health. The challenge lies in balancing the pursuit of efficiency and cost-effectiveness with the imperative to comply with these regulations, especially when faced with potential shortcuts or ambiguous interpretations. Careful judgment is required to ensure that operational decisions do not inadvertently lead to noncompliance, which can result in significant financial penalties, reputational damage, and harm to the environment. The correct approach involves a proactive and thorough assessment of the proposed operational change against all applicable environmental regulations. This means not only understanding the letter of the law, but also its spirit, which often emphasizes prevention of pollution and responsible resource management. Specifically, it requires engaging with environmental compliance experts within Norsk Hydro and potentially external consultants to interpret the regulations in the context of the proposed change. This approach prioritizes due diligence, risk mitigation, and adherence to the highest ethical standards, ensuring that Norsk Hydro operates as a responsible corporate citizen. The regulatory justification stems from the fundamental principles of environmental law, which mandate that companies must take all reasonable steps to prevent pollution and minimize their environmental footprint. Ethical considerations reinforce this, emphasizing a duty of care towards the environment and future generations. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the operational change based on a superficial understanding of the regulations, or by relying solely on the opinion of operational managers who may not have the necessary environmental compliance expertise. This could lead to overlooking critical requirements or misinterpreting ambiguous clauses, thereby risking noncompliance. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that because a similar practice has been followed in the past without apparent issue, it is automatically compliant. Regulatory frameworks evolve, and past leniency or lack of enforcement does not constitute a waiver of current obligations. Furthermore, prioritizing cost savings or operational expediency over a comprehensive regulatory review is a clear ethical and regulatory failure, as it suggests a disregard for legal obligations and environmental stewardship. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment framework. This begins with identifying the proposed change, then systematically evaluating its potential environmental impacts. Crucially, this evaluation must be informed by a thorough review of all relevant environmental laws, regulations, and internal company policies. Consultation with legal and environmental compliance departments is paramount. If there is any uncertainty or ambiguity, seeking clarification from regulatory bodies or obtaining expert legal opinions is advisable. The decision should then be based on whether the proposed change can be implemented in full compliance with all applicable requirements, with a bias towards caution and prevention when in doubt. Question 5. Operational review demonstrates a minor, intermittent discharge from a processing unit at a Norsk Hydro facility that appears to be within historical operational parameters, but has not been formally assessed against current environmental permit conditions. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the site operations manager? Option A. Inform the immediate supervisor of the observation and await their directive on how to proceed, prioritizing operational continuity. Option B. Initiate an immediate internal investigation to quantify the discharge and compare it against the facility's environmental permit, reporting any exceedances to the relevant Norwegian environmental authorities within the legally stipulated timeframe. Option C. Attempt to adjust operational settings to cease the discharge without formally reporting it, as it is a minor anomaly. Option D. Continue monitoring the discharge to gather more data, assuming it is within acceptable historical norms, and address it if it becomes a more significant issue. The correct answer is B. Initiate an immediate internal investigation to quantify the discharge and compare it against the facility's environmental permit, reporting any exceedances to the relevant Norwegian environmental authorities within the legally stipulated timeframe. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for Norsk Hydro employees due to the inherent conflict between achieving operational efficiency and adhering to strict environmental regulations. The pressure to meet production targets can create a temptation to overlook or downplay minor environmental deviations, especially if they are perceived as temporary or insignificant. Careful judgment is required to balance business objectives with legal and ethical responsibilities. The correct approach involves immediate and transparent reporting of the identified environmental anomaly to the relevant internal departments and regulatory bodies, as mandated by Norwegian environmental law and Norsk Hydro's own corporate governance policies. This demonstrates a commitment to compliance, proactive risk management, and environmental stewardship. By prioritizing regulatory adherence over short-term operational expediency, Norsk Hydro upholds its legal obligations and maintains its reputation as a responsible corporate citizen. An incorrect approach of attempting to rectify the issue internally without immediate reporting risks, violating reporting requirements under Norwegian environmental legislation. This could lead to significant penalties, reputational damage, and a loss of trust from regulatory authorities. Another incorrect approach of downplaying the anomaly or assuming it will resolve itself ignores the precautionary principle embedded in environmental law, which requires prompt action to prevent potential harm. This also fails to meet the ethical obligation to be transparent and accountable for environmental impacts. A third incorrect approach of waiting for further operational data before reporting, while seemingly data-driven, can be interpreted as a delay tactic and may still fall short of the timely notification obligations stipulated by regulations. Professionals at Norsk Hydro should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes compliance and ethical conduct. This involves understanding the relevant regulatory landscape, internal policies, and potential consequences of noncompliance. When faced with an operational issue that has potential environmental implications, the framework should guide them to 1. Assess the potential impact against regulatory thresholds. 2. Consult internal compliance and environmental departments. 3. Report any confirmed or suspected breaches to the appropriate authorities within the legally mandated timeframe. 4. Document all actions taken and communications. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are informed, defensible, and aligned with both legal requirements and corporate values. Question 6. Risk assessment procedures indicate a potential for exceeding permitted wastewater discharge limits at a Norsk Hydro facility due to an aging filtration system. The operations manager is concerned about the cost and downtime associated with immediate repairs or replacement, suggesting a temporary manual bypass of certain filtration stages to maintain production levels while a long-term solution is planned. Option A. Implement the proposed temporary manual bypass of filtration stages, with a commitment to investigate alternative, less disruptive repair options and to monitor discharge levels closely. Option B. Proceed with the temporary manual bypass as suggested by the operations manager, assuming that minor, temporary deviations from discharge limits are unlikely to be detected or result in significant penalties. Option C. Escalate the issue to senior management, requesting a directive on how to proceed, and await their decision before taking any action regarding the filtration system. Option D. Immediately halt operations at the affected section and initiate the procurement process for a new filtration system, prioritizing environmental compliance over short-term production targets. Correct answer is D. Immediately halt operations at the affected section and initiate the procurement process for a new filtration system, prioritizing environmental compliance over short-term production targets. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing immediate operational needs with long-term environmental compliance and stakeholder trust. Norsk Hydro, as a global company, operates under a complex web of regulations, and adherence to these is not merely a legal obligation, but a core aspect of its corporate social responsibility and reputation. The challenge lies in identifying and mitigating risks associated with potential noncompliance, especially when faced with pressures that might incentivize shortcuts. The correct approach involves a proactive and comprehensive risk assessment that prioritizes regulatory adherence and ethical conduct. This means systematically identifying potential environmental risks, evaluating their likelihood and impact, and implementing robust control measures. Specifically, it requires consulting with legal and environmental experts to ensure all actions align with the Norwegian environmental regulations governing Norsk Hydro's operations. This approach is ethically sound as it upholds the company's commitment to responsible environmental stewardship and legally defensible by ensuring compliance with the applicable regulatory framework. It fosters transparency and builds trust with regulatory bodies and the public. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the identified risks due to perceived operational inconvenience or cost. This demonstrates a failure to appreciate the severity of environmental regulations and the potential consequences of non-compliance, which can include significant fines, operational shutdowns, and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach would be to rely on anecdotal evidence or past practices without rigorous verification against current regulations. This neglects the dynamic nature of environmental law and the need for continuous adaptation. Furthermore, prioritizing short-term cost savings over long-term environmental protection is a clear ethical and regulatory failure, as it suggests a disregard for the company's duty of care and its social license to operate. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory landscape. This involves identifying all applicable laws and guidelines, such as those pertaining to emissions, waste management, and resource extraction in Norway. The next step is to conduct a comprehensive risk assessment, considering both the likelihood and potential impact of noncompliance. This assessment should inform the development of mitigation strategies, which must be evaluated for their effectiveness and feasibility. Finally, decisions should be made based on a clear understanding of the legal and ethical implications, with a preference for approaches that ensure compliance, protect the environment, and maintain stakeholder confidence. Question 7. Market research demonstrates that investors are increasingly scrutinizing the environmental, social, and governance-esque performance of companies like Norsk Hydro. In light of potential regulatory changes in Norway concerning carbon emissions reporting, Norsk Hydro's management is considering how to best communicate its current emissions data and future mitigation plans to stakeholders. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory requirements and stakeholder expectations? Option A. Proactively engage with the Norwegian Environment Agency to discuss potential regulatory changes, transparently report current emissions data, and clearly outline Norsk Hydro's detailed plans and timelines for reducing its carbon footprint, including any investments in new technologies. Option B. Delay reporting on current emissions until the regulatory changes are finalized, then issue a brief statement acknowledging the new requirements without detailing specific mitigation strategies. Option C. Lobby extensively for the postponement or weakening of any new carbon emissions regulations, emphasizing the potential financial burden on Norsk Hydro without offering concrete plans for emission reduction. Option D. Focus communication solely on Norsk Hydro's historical positive environmental achievements, omitting any mention of current emissions data or potential future challenges related to carbon reduction. Correct answer is A. Proactively engage with the Norwegian Environment Agency to discuss potential regulatory changes, transparently report current emissions data, and clearly outline Norsk Hydro's detailed plans and timelines for reducing its carbon footprint, including any investments in new technologies. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because Norsk Hydro, as a publicly traded company operating in a regulated industry, must balance various stakeholder interests while adhering to strict legal and ethical obligations. The pressure to achieve financial targets can sometimes conflict with the need for transparency and responsible environmental stewardship, creating complex decision-making situations. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing demands and ensure long-term sustainability and corporate reputation. The correct approach involves proactively engaging with regulatory bodies and clearly communicating Norsk Hydro's environmental performance and mitigation strategies. This demonstrates a commitment to compliance and responsible corporate citizenship. Specifically, adhering to the Norwegian regulatory framework for environmental reporting and emissions, as well as relevant EU directives that Norway is bound by, is paramount. This proactive communication builds trust with regulators, investors, and the public, mitigating potential reputational damage and legal repercussions. It aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and the ethical duty to operate transparently. An incorrect approach that prioritizes short-term cost savings by downplaying or delaying reporting of environmental noncompliance would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This would violate reporting obligations under Norwegian environmental law and potentially EU regulations, leading to fines, sanctions, and severe reputational damage. Another incorrect approach, which involves selectively disclosing positive environmental data while omitting negative findings, constitutes misleading communication and a breach of transparency principles, potentially violating securities regulations and consumer protection laws. Finally, an approach that seeks to lobby for weaker environmental regulations without a genuine commitment to improving performance would be ethically questionable and could undermine public trust and the company's social license to operate. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes compliance with all applicable regulations, ethical conduct, and transparent communication. This involves a thorough understanding of the regulatory landscape, a commitment to accurate and timely reporting, and a proactive approach to stakeholder engagement. When faced with conflicting pressures, the framework should guide decision-makers to seek solutions that uphold legal obligations and ethical standards, even if they involve short-term costs, to ensure long-term value creation and risk mitigation. Question 8. The control framework reveals a proposal to streamline Norsk Hydro's raw material procurement process to reduce lead times and associated costs. However, the proposed changes involve altering data entry points and approval workflows without explicit consultation with the internal audit or compliance departments. Which of the following represents the most appropriate professional response to this situation? Option A. Proceed with the proposed changes immediately to realize the anticipated efficiency gains, as the business unit owner has confirmed the changes are minor and will not impact overall financial reporting accuracy. Option B. Implement the changes but instruct the business unit to maintain manual logs of all transactions to serve as a backup, relying on the business unit owner's assurance that the new process is sound. Option C. Halt the implementation of the proposed changes and initiate a formal review process involving internal audit, compliance, and relevant business units to assess the control implications and ensure adherence to Norsk Hydro's internal control framework and relevant regulations. Option D. Focus solely on the cost savings and lead time reduction benefits of the proposed changes, deferring any control-related assessments until after the implementation is complete and operational benefits are realized. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the proposed changes immediately to realize the anticipated efficiency gains, as the business unit owner has confirmed the changes are minor and will not impact overall financial reporting accuracy. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because Norsk Hydro, as a publicly traded company operating in a regulated industry, must balance efficiency gains with strict adherence to its internal control framework and relevant external regulations. The pressure to optimize processes can sometimes lead to shortcuts or overlooking critical compliance steps, creating a tension between operational goals and governance responsibilities. Careful judgment is required to ensure that process improvements do not inadvertently compromise the integrity of financial reporting or operational compliance. The correct approach involves a systematic review and validation of the proposed process changes by the internal audit function, in conjunction with relevant business units and compliance officers. This ensures that any optimization is assessed not only for its efficiency benefits, but also for its impact on the control environment, regulatory compliance, and the accuracy of financial data. This aligns with the principles of robust corporate governance and the need for independent assurance over internal controls, as often mandated by regulatory bodies overseeing financial reporting and operational conduct. An approach that bypasses established internal control validation procedures to implement changes quickly is professionally unacceptable. This failure represents a disregard for the established governance mechanisms designed to prevent errors and fraud, and to ensure compliance. It creates a significant risk of undetected control weaknesses, potentially leading to misstatements in financial reports or non-compliance with industry-specific regulations, which could result in penalties and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach, focusing solely on cost reduction without considering the control implications, is also professionally flawed. Cost efficiency is a legitimate business objective. It cannot come at the expense of control integrity. This approach demonstrates a lack of holistic risk assessment and a failure to integrate operational goals with the broader compliance and governance framework. A third incorrect approach, relying on informal assurances from the process owner without documented validation, is professionally unsound. This introduces subjectivity and a lack of accountability into the control environment. It undermines the principle of independent verification and creates a reliance on individual assurances rather than objective evidence of control effectiveness. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes risk assessment and compliance. When considering process changes, the initial step should be to identify potential impacts on internal controls and regulatory requirements. This should be followed by engaging the appropriate control and compliance functions for review and approval. Any proposed changes must be documented, tested for effectiveness, and formally implemented with ongoing monitoring. This structured approach ensures that efficiency is pursued responsibly within the bounds of regulatory and ethical obligations. Question 9. Investigation of potential process optimizations at Norsk Hydro's aluminium production facilities requires a thorough understanding of the applicable regulatory framework. Which of the following approaches best ensures that proposed changes are both efficient and compliant with Norwegian environmental and industrial safety laws? Option A. Prioritizing cost reduction by implementing the most widely adopted industry best practices globally, assuming they meet general efficiency standards. Option B. Relying on internal operational experience and historical data without consulting external regulatory bodies or updated legal requirements. Option C. Focusing on adopting the newest technological advancements available in the market, irrespective of specific Norwegian regulatory approval. Option D. Conducting a comprehensive review of all relevant Norwegian environmental legislation, industrial safety regulations, and Norsk Hydro's internal operational guidelines to ensure full compliance before implementing any changes. The correct answer is A. Prioritizing cost reduction by implementing the most widely adopted industry best practices globally, assuming they meet general efficiency standards. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for Norsk Hydro employees tasked with optimizing a critical process. The challenge lies in balancing the drive for efficiency and cost reduction with the imperative to adhere strictly to all applicable regulatory frameworks, particularly those governing environmental impact and operational safety. Misinterpreting or overlooking specific regulatory requirements can lead to significant legal penalties, reputational damage, and most importantly, harm to the environment and human safety. Therefore, a meticulous and legally informed approach is paramount. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review of all relevant Norwegian environmental and industrial regulations, alongside Norsk Hydro's internal operational guidelines and best practices. This ensures that any proposed process optimization is not only economically viable, but also fully compliant with legal obligations. Specifically, this would entail consulting the Norwegian Environmental Protection Act, Forurensningsloven, the relevant regulations from the Norwegian Environment Agency, Miljødirektoratet, and any specific permits or licenses Norsk Hydro holds. The ethical justification stems from the duty of care to operate responsibly, minimizing environmental footprint and ensuring worker safety, which are foundational principles in corporate governance and environmental stewardship. Incorrect approach is analysis, an approach that prioritizes only cost reduction without a thorough regulatory review risks, violating environmental discharge limits or safety protocols, leading to fines and operational shutdowns. It fails to uphold the ethical obligation to operate within legal boundaries, an approach that focuses solely on adopting the latest available technology without verifying its compliance with Norwegian regulations could introduce new environmental risks or operational hazards that are not permitted. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for established legal frameworks. An approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or industry trends from other jurisdictions without specific verification against Norwegian law is fundamentally flawed. Regulations are jurisdiction-specific, and what is permissible elsewhere may be illegal in Norway, leading to non-compliance and potential legal repercussions. Professional reasoning. Professionals at Norsk Hydro should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with identifying the specific regulatory landscape applicable to the process in question. This involves consulting official government sources and legal counsel if necessary. The next step is to assess proposed optimizations against these regulations, ensuring no aspect conflicts with legal requirements or ethical standards. Any proposed change must undergo a rigorous impact assessment, considering environmental, safety, and legal implications. This systematic approach ensures that process optimization contributes to the company's goals without compromising its legal standing or ethical responsibilities. Question 10. The audit findings indicate that certain procurement processes at Norsk Hydro's Norwegian operations may not have fully adhered to the company's internal control policies and potentially relevant Norwegian regulations concerning public tenders and supplier due diligence. Specifically, the audit highlighted instances where competitive bidding procedures were bypassed without adequate documented justification, and where supplier background checks were less rigorous than stipulated. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for Norsk Hydro's management to address these audit findings? Option A. Engage external legal counsel to assess potential liabilities and advise on a public relations strategy to mitigate reputational damage before commencing any internal review. Option B. Issue a directive to all procurement staff to strictly adhere to existing policies moving forward, assuming the deviations were isolated incidents and not indicative of systemic issues. Option C. Immediately suspend all ongoing procurement activities until a full review of all past transactions can be completed to avoid any further potential noncompliance. Option D. Initiate a comprehensive internal investigation to ascertain the extent of the deviations, understand the root causes, and determine if any Norwegian regulations have been breached, while simultaneously reviewing and reinforcing internal control procedures. The correct answer is D. Initiate a comprehensive internal investigation to ascertain the extent of the deviations, understand the root causes, and determine if any Norwegian regulations have been breached, while simultaneously reviewing and reinforcing internal control procedures. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires navigating potential conflicts between internal company policies, ethical consideration, and the overarching regulatory framework governing Norsk Hydro's operations within its specified jurisdiction. The auditor's findings suggest a deviation from established procedures, potentially impacting the integrity of financial reporting and compliance. Careful judgment is required to determine the most appropriate course of action that upholds both corporate governance and regulatory adherence. The correct approach involves a thorough, objective investigation of the audit findings, focusing on understanding the root cause of the identified discrepancies. This approach is professionally sound because it prioritizes factual accuracy and compliance with the relevant regulatory framework. By engaging with the relevant internal departments and potentially seeking external expertise if necessary, the company demonstrates a commitment to transparency and rectifying any noncompliance. This aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and the regulatory expectation that companies operate within legal boundaries, ensuring the reliability of their financial statements and operational integrity. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the audit findings without proper investigation, especially if there is pressure to avoid negative publicity or internal repercussions. This failure to address potential regulatory breaches could lead to significant penalties, reputational damage, and a breakdown of trust with stakeholders. Another incorrect approach would be to implement superficial corrective measures that do not address the underlying issues, thereby creating a false sense of compliance. This would also be a failure to meet regulatory obligations and could result in continued noncompliance. A third incorrect approach might involve selectively sharing information or attempting to influence the outcome of the investigation to protect individuals or departments, which would be a clear ethical and regulatory failure, undermining the integrity of the audit process and potentially obstructing justice. Professionals in similar situations should employ a structured decision-making process. This involves 1. Acknowledging and documenting the audit findings. 2. Initiating an objective and thorough investigation to understand the facts and root causes. 3. Consulting the relevant internal policies and the specific regulatory framework applicable to Norsk Hydro's operations. 4. Identifying and evaluating potential corrective actions based on the investigation and regulatory requirements. 5. Implementing the chosen corrective actions with clear accountability and monitoring mechanisms. 6. Communicating findings and actions appropriately to relevant stakeholders, ensuring transparency and compliance. Question 11. System analysis indicates that Norsk Hydro is in the process of evaluating a potential significant operational disruption at one of its key production facilities. While the full extent of the impact is still being assessed, preliminary internal reports suggest it could affect production volumes and profitability for the upcoming quarter. What is the most appropriate course of action for Norsk Hydro's management team to ensure compliance with regulatory disclosure requirements? Option A. Issue a brief statement acknowledging a minor operational issue without providing specific details to manage market expectations without causing undue concern. Option B. Conduct a thorough internal assessment to determine the materiality of the operational disruption and its potential impact on Norsk Hydro's financial performance and share price, and if deemed material, proceed with prompt and accurate public disclosure. Option C. Inform key institutional investors and analysts about the potential disruption privately to gauge their reactions before making a public statement. Option D. Delay any public announcement until the full impact is definitively quantified, to avoid potentially alarming investors with incomplete or speculative information. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough internal assessment to determine the materiality of the operational disruption and its potential impact on Norsk Hydro's financial performance and share price, and if deemed material, proceed with prompt and accurate public disclosure. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Norsk Hydro, as a publicly listed company, operates under stringent regulatory frameworks designed to ensure transparency, fairness, and accuracy in financial reporting. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the need for timely information dissemination with the obligation to provide complete and accurate disclosures, particularly when dealing with potentially material events. Misinterpreting or misapplying regulatory requirements can lead to significant legal, financial, and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to discern when information becomes material and necessitates immediate disclosure versus when it is still under internal review and not yet reportable. The correct approach involves a proactive and thorough internal assessment process, guided by the principles of regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This approach prioritizes understanding the specific disclosure obligations under the relevant regulatory framework, which for Norsk Hydro would typically involve the rules of the stock exchange on which its shares are listed and national securities laws. It necessitates a diligent review of the information's potential impact on the company's financial position, operations, or share price. If the information is deemed material, the correct approach mandates prompt and accurate disclosure to the market, ensuring all stakeholders receive the same information simultaneously. This aligns with the regulatory objective of preventing insider trading and maintaining market integrity. An incorrect approach that involves withholding information due to uncertainty about its materiality or potential negative impact is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This can be construed as market manipulation or an attempt to mislead investors, violating principles of fair disclosure. Another incorrect approach, which is to disclose incomplete or preliminary information without proper context or qualification, can lead to market confusion and misinterpretation, potentially causing undue volatility and investor losses. This also breaches the duty of accuracy and completeness in disclosures. Furthermore, relying solely on informal communication channels or selectively informing certain parties before a formal public announcement constitutes a breach of equal access to information, a cornerstone of fair markets. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the applicable regulatory disclosure obligations. This involves establishing clear internal policies and procedures for identifying, assessing, and disclosing material information. When faced with potentially material information, professionals should engage in a structured review process, consulting with legal, finance, and investor relations departments. This collaborative approach ensures that all relevant perspectives are considered and that the assessment of materiality is robust. The decision to disclose should be based on established criteria and regulatory guidance, prioritizing transparency and accuracy above all else. If in doubt, erring on the side of caution and seeking expert advice or making a timely, albeit cautious, disclosure is generally the more prudent and compliant course of action. Question 12. When evaluating a proposed operational efficiency improvement at Norsk hydro facility that involves modifying a waste treatment process, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with environmental regulations? Option A. Implement the modification immediately to realize efficiency gains and address any potential regulatory concerns only if they arise. Option B. Proceed with the modification if it is deemed to improve overall environmental performance and inform the relevant regulatory body after implementation. Option C. Conduct a thorough impact assessment, consult the existing environmental permits and regulations, and seek formal approval from the regulatory authority before implementing the modified process. Option D. Rely on internal company guidelines for waste treatment, assuming they meet or exceed regulatory standards, and proceed with the modification without external consultation. The correct answer is B. Proceed with the modification if it is deemed to improve overall environmental performance and inform the relevant regulatory body after implementation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's operational needs and the strict adherence to environmental regulations. Norsk Hydro, as a global entity, must navigate complex and often stringent environmental laws, particularly concerning emissions and waste management. The challenge lies in balancing the economic pressures to maintain production levels with the legal and ethical imperative to protect the environment. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any operational adjustments do not inadvertently lead to noncompliance, which could result in significant fines, reputational damage, and operational disruptions. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent engagement with regulatory bodies. This means not only understanding the current environmental permits and regulations applicable to Norsk Hydro's operations, but also anticipating potential changes or stricter interpretations. It requires a commitment to continuous monitoring, robust internal control systems, and a willingness to seek clarification or variances through established legal channels. This approach is professionally sound because it prioritizes compliance, demonstrates good corporate citizenship, and mitigates legal and financial risks. It aligns with the principles of responsible industrial practice and the overarching goal of sustainable operations, which are often implicitly or explicitly embedded in regulatory frameworks. An incorrect approach would be to assume that minor deviations from standard operating procedures, even if intended to improve efficiency, are permissible without explicit regulatory review. This could manifest as altering emission control parameters without prior approval or disposing of byproducts in a manner not explicitly covered by existing permits. Such actions are professionally unacceptable because they disregard the precautionary principle inherent in environmental law, which aims to prevent harm before it occurs. Furthermore, this approach risks violating specific regulatory requirements, such as those found in Environmental Protection Acts or specific industry guidelines, leading to penalties. Another incorrect approach would be to delay reporting potential environmental incidents or to downplay their significance. This is ethically and legally flawed as it undermines the transparency expected by regulators and can exacerbate any environmental damage, leading to more severe consequences for Norsk Hydro. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of all applicable environmental regulations and permit conditions. This should be followed by a risk assessment of any proposed operational changes, considering potential environmental impacts and regulatory implications. When in doubt, seeking expert legal and environmental advice and engaging in open communication with regulatory authorities is paramount. This proactive and compliant approach ensures that operational decisions are not only economically viable, but also legally defensible and ethically responsible. Question 13. The evaluation methodology shows that Norsk Hydro is developing a new, potentially disruptive technology. Which approach to assessing and communicating the impact of this technology best aligns with regulatory requirements for market integrity and fair disclosure? Option A. Delay the formal impact assessment and any market communication until the technology is fully commercialized to maximize competitive advantage. Option B. Share preliminary positive findings with key institutional investors to gauge their reaction and refine the technology's market positioning. Option C. Conduct a thorough, objective impact assessment and develop a structured communication plan for timely, broad market disclosure of material findings. Option D. Focus the impact assessment solely on operational efficiencies, omitting potential market or financial implications to avoid premature market speculation. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough, objective impact assessment and develop a structured communication plan for timely, broad market disclosure of material findings. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Norsk Hydro, as a publicly traded company, operates under stringent regulatory frameworks designed to ensure transparency, fairness, and the integrity of financial reporting. The challenge lies in balancing the need for timely information dissemination with the imperative to avoid market manipulation or providing selective advantages to certain stakeholders. Misinterpreting or misapplying the regulatory requirements for impact assessments can lead to significant legal repercussions, reputational damage, and loss of investor confidence. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all assessments are conducted with objectivity and that any resulting disclosures are made in a manner that is compliant with relevant regulations. The correct approach involves a comprehensive and objective assessment of the potential impact of the new technology on Norsk Hydro's operations, financial performance, and market position. This assessment must be grounded in factual data and a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory landscape. Following this, a structured and transparent communication plan should be developed, ensuring that any material information is disclosed to the market in accordance with regulatory timelines and requirements, such as those mandated by financial market authorities. This approach upholds the principles of fair disclosure and market integrity, preventing insider trading and ensuring all investors have access to the same material information simultaneously. An incorrect approach would be to prematurely disclose preliminary findings or speculative benefits of the new technology to a select group of investors or analysts before a full impact assessment is complete and before a formal disclosure to the broader market is made. This constitutes selective disclosure, which is a violation of market abuse regulations. Another incorrect approach would be to delay the impact assessment and subsequent disclosure indefinitely, hoping to gain a competitive advantage by withholding information. This can also be viewed as market manipulation or a failure to comply with disclosure obligations. Finally, conducting a superficial or biased impact assessment that exaggerates potential benefits or downplays risks to influence market perception would be a severe ethical and regulatory breach, undermining the credibility of Norsk Hydro. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Understanding the specific disclosure obligations under the relevant jurisdiction's securities laws and stock exchange rules. 2. Conducting thorough and objective impact assessments, documenting all assumptions and methodologies. 3. Establishing clear internal procedures for the review and approval of all market-sensitive information before disclosure. 4. Consulting with legal and compliance departments to ensure all actions align with regulatory requirements. 5. Prioritizing fair and simultaneous disclosure of material information to all market participants. Question 14. Analysis of Norsk Hydro's proposed expansion project in a sensitive coastal region, where preliminary site investigations suggest potential impacts on marine ecosystems, requires a strategic approach to environmental compliance. Considering the company's commitment to sustainable operations and adherence to Norwegian environmental law, which of the following approaches best ensures regulatory adherence and responsible project development? Option A. Delay the formal EIA process until after the initial construction phases are complete, focusing solely on meeting immediate production targets. Option B. Immediately commence construction activities to meet project deadlines, with a plan to address any environmental concerns that arise during the operational phase. Option C. Initiate a comprehensive environmental impact assessment (IA) process as mandated by Norwegian regulations, engaging with relevant environmental authorities and stakeholders to identify, evaluate, and mitigate potential impacts before significant project commitments are made. Option D. Conduct a brief internal review of potential environmental issues and proceed with construction if the perceived risks are deemed manageable by the project team. The correct answer is B. Immediately commence construction activities to meet project deadlines, with a plan to address any environmental concerns that arise during the operational phase. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge for Norsk Hydro employees due to the inherent conflict between operational efficiency and the imperative to adhere to strict environmental impact assessment regulations. The need to balance timely project execution with thorough, legally mandated environmental scrutiny requires careful judgment and a robust understanding of regulatory frameworks. The correct approach involves a proactive and comprehensive engagement with the regulatory framework governing environmental impact assessments. This entails initiating the formal impact assessment process early in the project lifecycle, engaging with relevant authorities, and ensuring all potential environmental consequences are identified, evaluated, and mitigated according to established guidelines. This approach is professionally sound because it aligns with the principles of responsible corporate citizenship and the legal obligations imposed by environmental regulations. Specifically, it demonstrates a commitment to transparency, due diligence, and the prevention of environmental harm, which are core tenets of regulatory compliance and ethical business conduct. Incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate operational needs over the impact assessment process is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for the legal mandate to conduct such assessments, potentially leading to significant environmental damage, legal penalties, and reputational damage for Norsk Hydro. Another incorrect approach, which involves conducting a superficial or incomplete assessment, also violates regulatory requirements. This can occur if the assessment fails to identify all significant impacts or if proposed mitigation measures are inadequate. Such an approach undermines the purpose of the impact assessment, which is to ensure that projects proceed only after potential environmental risks have been thoroughly understood and addressed. A third incorrect approach, which involves delaying the initiation of the impact assessment until significant project milestones have been reached, is also flawed. This delay can lead to costly project redesigns or even project cancellation if significant environmental issues are discovered late in the process, demonstrating a lack of foresight and adherence to best practices in project management and environmental stewardship. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the applicable regulatory requirements. This involves identifying all relevant environmental laws and guidelines, consulting with legal and environmental experts, and integrating these requirements into the project planning phase from the outset. When faced with competing priorities, professionals must prioritize compliance with legal and ethical obligations, recognizing that short-term gains achieved through regulatory shortcuts can lead to long-term severe consequences. A structured approach, including risk assessment and stakeholder engagement, is crucial for navigating complex projects and ensuring responsible environmental management. Question 15. The audit findings indicate a significant lapse in the consistent application of the mandatory pre-employment screening protocols for all candidates applying to Norsk Hydro's technical roles, potentially impacting compliance with internal hiring policies and relevant industry standards. Which of the following represents the most professionally responsible and effective course of action for the hiring team to address this finding? Option A. Request an exemption from the full screening process for a defined period to allow the team to focus on urgent hiring needs, with a promise to revisit the screening protocols later. Option B. Immediately implement a revised training module for all hiring managers and recruiters, focusing on the correct execution of pre-employment screening and establish a quarterly review process to monitor adherence and identify any emerging deviations. Option C. Acknowledge the audit finding in the next departmental meeting and instruct all staff to be more diligent in following existing screening procedures without further immediate action. Option D. Develop a simplified, abridged version of the screening checklist to expedite the process for high-priority candidates, assuming the core requirements are still met. The correct answer is B. Immediately implement a revised training module for all hiring managers and recruiters, focusing on the correct execution of pre-employment screening, and establish a quarterly review process to monitor adherence and identify any emerging deviations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the potential conflict between immediate operational needs and the long-term integrity of Norsk Hydro's compliance framework. The audit findings highlight a gap in the implementation of a critical regulatory requirement, necessitating a swift yet compliant response. Careful judgment is required to balance the urgency of addressing the identified deficiency, with the need to ensure that any corrective actions are robust, sustainable, and fully aligned with the specified regulatory framework for the Norsk Hydro hiring assessment test. The correct approach involves a thorough root cause analysis to understand why the implementation failed, followed by the development and execution of a comprehensive remediation plan that includes updated training, process adjustments, and verification mechanisms. This approach is professionally sound because it directly addresses the underlying issues identified by the audit, ensuring that the corrective actions are not merely superficial, but tackle the systemic reasons for non-compliance. This aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and regulatory adherence, aiming to prevent recurrence and maintain the integrity of Norsk Hydro's operations and hiring processes. An incorrect approach of simply documenting the finding without immediate action risks perpetuating the compliance gap, potentially leading to further regulatory scrutiny or operational inefficiencies. This fails to meet the proactive compliance expectations inherent in any robust hiring assessment framework. Another incorrect approach, that of implementing a quick fix without understanding the root cause, might temporarily address the symptom but leaves the underlying vulnerability unaddressed, making future noncompliance likely and demonstrating a lack of due diligence. A third incorrect approach, which involves bypassing established internal control procedures to expedite remediation, undermines the very framework designed to ensure compliance and could introduce new risks, violating principles of sound internal control and ethical conduct. Professionals facing such situations should employ a structured decision-making process. This involves 1. Acknowledging and understanding the audit findings in their entirety. 2. Prioritizing the identified risks based on their potential impact on Norsk Hydro's operations and regulatory standing. 3. Conducting a root cause analysis to identify the fundamental reasons for the deficiency. 4. Developing a remediation plan that is proportionate to the risk, addresses the root cause, and includes clear timelines and accountability. 5. Seeking appropriate internal or external expertise if needed. 6. Implementing the plan with robust monitoring and verification to ensure effectiveness. 7. Documenting all steps taken and lessons learned. Question 16. The assessment process reveals that a candidate for a strategic role at Norsk Hydro has presented a detailed competitive analysis that includes insights into a rival company's upcoming product development pipeline. The candidate claims this information was gathered through publicly available sources and industry networking. However, the depth and specificity of the information raise questions about its true origin. Which of the following represents the most professionally responsible course of action for Norsk Hydro in evaluating this candidate and the presented information? Option A. Forward the information to Norsk Hydro's legal department for an immediate investigation into potential corporate espionage. Option B. Conduct a thorough internal review of the information's provenance and Norsk Hydro's policies on competitive intelligence before making any decision on its use or the candidate's suitability. Option C. Acknowledge the candidate's effort but politely decline to use the information, citing a lack of verifiable ethical sourcing. Option D. Immediately integrate the competitive analysis into Norsk Hydro's strategic planning due to its potential value, assuming the candidate acted ethically. The correct answer is D. Immediately integrate the competitive analysis into Norsk Hydro's strategic planning due to its potential value, assuming the candidate acted ethically. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a scenario where a candidate for Norsk Hydro has presented information that, while potentially beneficial to the company, may have been obtained through means that skirt ethical boundaries or violate internal Norsk Hydro policies regarding competitive intelligence. This presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the potential for strategic advantage with the imperative to uphold integrity and compliance. Careful judgment is required to discern between legitimate market research and potentially problematic information acquisition. The correct approach involves a thorough internal review of the information's origin and a cautious, policy-driven integration process. This means verifying that the information was acquired through ethical and legal channels, in line with Norsk Hydro's Code of Conduct and any specific guidelines on competitive intelligence. If the information's provenance is questionable, the professional decision is to refrain from using it and to report the concern internally, thereby upholding Norsk Hydro's commitment to ethical business practices and avoiding potential legal or reputational damage. This aligns with principles of corporate responsibility and good governance, ensuring that Norsk Hydro operates with integrity. An incorrect approach would be to immediately leverage the information without due diligence. This fails to address the potential ethical or legal breaches in its acquisition. Such an action could expose Norsk Hydro to accusations of unfair competition, intellectual property infringement, or other violations, leading to significant legal penalties and severe reputational damage. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the information outright without any internal review, as it might represent a missed opportunity for legitimate strategic insight. However, the primary ethical failure lies in the uncritical acceptance and use of potentially improperly obtained information. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical conduct and compliance. This involves 1. Information assessment. Scrutinize the source and method of information acquisition. 2. Policy alignment. Compare the acquisition method against Norsk Hydro's internal policies and relevant industry best practices. 3. Risk evaluation. Assess the potential legal, ethical, and reputational risks associated with using the information. 4. Consultation. If in doubt, consult with legal, compliance, or senior management. 5. Action. Proceed with caution, utilizing the information only if its acquisition is demonstrably ethical and compliant, or escalate concerns if it is not. Question 17. Research into potential process optimizations at Norsk Hydro's Norwegian facilities has identified several avenues for improving operational efficiency. One proposed optimization involves streamlining waste disposal protocols to reduce handling time and associated costs. Considering Norsk Hydro's commitment to environmental stewardship and adherence to Norwegian environmental legislation, which of the following approaches best aligns with responsible process optimization? Option A. Conducting a comprehensive environmental impact assessment for the proposed waste disposal optimization, engaging with relevant regulatory bodies in Norway, and developing mitigation strategies for any identified risks before implementation. Option B. Deferring the waste disposal optimization indefinitely due to the complexity of regulatory compliance, focusing instead on less regulated aspects of operations. Option C. Prioritizing the waste disposal optimization that offers the most significant cost reduction, assuming that existing waste management permits will cover the revised procedures. Option D. Implementing the waste disposal optimization immediately based on projected cost savings, with a plan to address any potential regulatory issues that may arise post-implementation. The correct answer is D. Implementing the waste disposal optimization immediately based on projected cost savings, with a plan to address any potential regulatory issues that may arise post-implementation. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because Norsk Hydro, as a publicly traded company operating in a highly regulated industry, must balance efficiency gains with strict adherence to environmental and safety regulations. The pressure to optimize processes can sometimes lead to shortcuts that might inadvertently violate these regulations or compromise ethical standards. Careful judgment is required to ensure that process improvements do not create new risks or negatively impact stakeholders, including the environment and local communities. The correct approach involves a thorough, data-driven assessment of potential process optimizations that explicitly considers their impact on regulatory compliance and environmental sustainability. This means proactively identifying and mitigating any risks associated with proposed changes, ensuring that all relevant Norwegian environmental laws, safety standards, and Norsk Hydro's internal ethical guidelines are not only met but potentially exceeded. This approach demonstrates a commitment to responsible corporate citizenship and long-term value creation, aligning with the principles of sustainable business practices expected in the industry. An incorrect approach that prioritizes cost reduction without a comprehensive regulatory impact assessment is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for legal obligations, potentially leading to fines, reputational damage, and operational disruptions. Another incorrect approach that focuses solely on speed of implementation, overlooking the need for thorough risk analysis and stakeholder consultation, also poses significant risks. This can result in unforeseen environmental incidents or safety breaches, undermining trust and potentially leading to severe legal and financial repercussions. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the full scope of regulatory requirements and ethical considerations relevant to Norsk Hydro's operations in Norway. This involves engaging with compliance officers, environmental specialists, and relevant internal departments early in the process optimization lifecycle. The framework should prioritize a risk-based approach, where potential optimizations are evaluated not just for their efficiency benefits, but also for their potential to create new regulatory or ethical challenges. Continuous monitoring and review of implemented changes are also crucial to ensure ongoing compliance and to adapt to evolving regulatory landscapes. Question 18. The performance metrics show that the Q3 production targets for a key Norsk Hydro facility are likely to be missed based on preliminary data. Your direct manager is urging you to present the figures as if the targets are met, suggesting that final adjustments will be made later. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Adjust the preliminary data to reflect the targets being met, with a note that final adjustments will be made in the next reporting cycle. Option B. Wait until the final figures are available, hoping they will improve before reporting any performance data. Option C. Focus on highlighting other positive performance indicators to offset the production shortfall in your report. Option D. Immediately report the preliminary data accurately and escalate the discrepancy to the Norsk Hydro Compliance Department and relevant financial oversight. Correct answer is D. Immediately report the preliminary data accurately and escalate the discrepancy to the Norsk Hydro Compliance Department and relevant financial oversight. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge where a Norsk Hydro employee faces pressure to meet ambitious performance targets that may conflict with ethical reporting standards. The challenge lies in balancing the drive for results with the imperative of accurate and transparent financial disclosure, especially when preliminary data suggests a potential shortfall. Misrepresenting performance can have severe consequences for investor confidence, regulatory compliance, and the company's reputation. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves immediately escalating the discrepancy to the appropriate internal stakeholders, such as the finance department or compliance officer, and ensuring that all reporting accurately reflects the preliminary data, even if it falls short of targets. This upholds Norsk Hydro's commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory compliance, as mandated by Norwegian financial reporting laws and corporate governance principles. Transparency in reporting, even when unfavorable, is crucial for maintaining trust with investors and regulators. Incorrect approaches analysis. Falsifying or manipulating preliminary data to meet targets is a direct violation of accounting principles and securities regulations, leading to potential legal penalties and severe reputational damage. It undermines the integrity of financial reporting. Delaying the reporting of the shortfall to await more favorable final figures without proper disclosure of the uncertainty constitutes misleading communication. This can be interpreted as an attempt to deceive stakeholders and is contrary to principles of timely and accurate disclosure. Focusing solely on the pressure to meet targets without considering the accuracy of the underlying data demonstrates a disregard for ethical obligations and regulatory requirements. This approach prioritizes short-term gains over long-term integrity and compliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals in such situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Identifying the ethical and regulatory conflict. 2. Gathering all relevant factual information. 3. Consulting internal policies and relevant regulations. 4. Escalating the issue to the appropriate authorities within the organization. 5. Acting with transparency and integrity, even when faced with pressure. Question 19. Comparative studies suggest that process optimization within a corporate hiring assessment context requires careful consideration of the assessment's specific jurisdictional boundaries. For Norsk Hydro's hiring assessment test, which focuses on process optimization, what is the most critical factor to consider when proposing any optimization strategy? Option A. Prioritizing speed of implementation over strict adherence to the assessment's defined rules to demonstrate agility. Option B. Implementing general industry best practices for process optimization that have proven effective in other companies. Option C. Introducing innovative optimization techniques that are not explicitly mentioned in the assessment's guidelines but could lead to significant efficiency gains. Option D. Ensuring the proposed optimization strategy strictly adheres to the regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines explicitly specified for the Norsk Hydro hiring assessment test. The correct answer is D. Ensuring the proposed optimization strategy strictly adheres to the regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines explicitly specified for the Norsk Hydro hiring assessment test. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for Norsk Hydro employees tasked with optimizing processes. The challenge lies in balancing the pursuit of efficiency gains with the imperative to adhere strictly to the Norsk Hydro hiring assessment test's specific regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines. Misinterpreting or deviating from these prescribed rules, even with the intention of improving outcomes, can lead to assessment failure and potentially compromise ethical standards if those standards are implicitly or explicitly defined within the assessment's jurisdiction. The need for deep analytical judgment is paramount to ensure that any proposed optimization aligns precisely with the assessment's constraints. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding and application of the Norsk Hydro hiring assessment test's specific regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines. This means prioritizing adherence to the assessment's defined jurisdiction above all else. The justification for this approach is rooted in the fundamental purpose of a hiring assessment: to evaluate a candidate's ability to operate within the defined parameters of the role and the company's operational and legal environment. By strictly following the assessment's rules, a candidate demonstrates an understanding of compliance, attention to detail, and the ability to work within established boundaries, which are critical professional attributes for any employee at Norsk Hydro. This aligns with the ethical principle of honesty and integrity in the assessment process. Incorrect approach is analysis, an approach that prioritizes general industry best practices for process optimization without first ensuring they are compatible with the Norsk Hydro hiring assessment test's specific regulatory framework, is incorrect. This fails because it disregards the primary constraint of the assessment, which is to operate solely within its defined jurisdiction. Such an approach demonstrates a lack of understanding of the assessment's purpose and a potential for non-compliance. Another incorrect approach would be to introduce concepts or methodologies that are explicitly outside the scope or jurisdiction defined by the Norsk Hydro hiring assessment test. This could involve referencing external regulations or standards not mentioned in the assessment's guidelines. This is professionally unacceptable, as it shows an inability to focus on the specific requirements of the task and a disregard for the established assessment parameters. Finally, an approach that attempts to infer or assume flexibility in the assessment's rules, even if it seems to lead to a more efficient outcome, is also incorrect. This demonstrates a lack of discipline and an unwillingness to adhere to explicit instructions, which are foundational ethical and professional requirements in any assessment or operational context. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing similar situations should first meticulously identify and internalize all specified regulatory frameworks, laws, and guidelines relevant to the task or assessment. The next step is to critically evaluate any proposed optimization or solution against these defined parameters, ensuring absolute compliance. If there is any ambiguity, seeking clarification from the assessment administrators or relevant internal compliance departments is crucial. The decision-making process should always begin with a compliance-first mindset, where adherence to the established jurisdiction is the non-negotiable prerequisite for any further analysis or action. This ensures that efficiency is pursued within the bounds of legality, ethics, and the specific requirements of the organization or assessment. Question 20. The control framework reveals that a procurement manager at Norsk Hydro is responsible for evaluating bids from several suppliers for a critical project. The manager discovers that one of the bidding companies is owned by their sibling. What is the most appropriate course of action for the procurement manager to ensure the integrity of the Norsk Hydro's procurement process and comply with ethical guidelines? Option A. Proceed with the evaluation as planned, assuming the personal relationship will not influence their professional judgment, and focus solely on the technical and commercial merits of the bid. Option B. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to their direct supervisor and the relevant compliance department, and recuse themselves from any further involvement in the evaluation and selection process for that specific supplier. Option C. Downplay the significance of the relationship to colleagues involved in the evaluation, stating it is a distant familial connection that poses no real conflict. Option D. Discreetly inquire with the siblings' company about their bid details to ensure it is competitive, without explicitly mentioning the personal relationship, before deciding on further action. Correct answer is B. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to their direct supervisor and the relevant compliance department, and recuse themselves from any further involvement in the evaluation and selection process for that specific supplier. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at Norsk Hydro to navigate a situation where a potential conflict of interest could arise, impacting the integrity of procurement processes and potentially leading to reputational damage or regulatory scrutiny. The core of the challenge lies in identifying and appropriately managing such conflicts to uphold ethical standards and regulatory compliance. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between legitimate business relationships and situations that could compromise impartiality. The correct approach involves proactively disclosing the personal relationship to the relevant internal stakeholders and seeking guidance on how to proceed, which may include recusal from decision-making processes related to the supplier. This demonstrates a commitment to transparency and adherence to Norsk Hydro's internal policies and any applicable Norwegian regulations concerning conflicts of interest in business dealings. By disclosing, the individual ensures that the procurement process remains fair, transparent, and free from undue influence, thereby safeguarding Norsk Hydro's interests and maintaining stakeholder trust. This aligns with general principles of good corporate governance and ethical conduct expected within the Norwegian business environment. An incorrect approach of proceeding with the evaluation without disclosure would be professionally unacceptable. This failure to disclose a potential conflict of interest directly violates principles of transparency and impartiality, which are fundamental to ethical business practices and regulatory compliance. It creates an environment where decisions could be perceived as biased, even if no actual impropriety occurred, leading to a loss of trust among colleagues, management, and external stakeholders. Furthermore, depending on specific Norwegian corporate law and Norsk Hydro's internal code of conduct, such an omission could constitute a breach of duty and potentially lead to disciplinary action or legal repercussions. Another incorrect approach of downplaying the significance of the relationship and proceeding with the evaluation, believing it wouldn't influence the outcome, is also professionally unsound. While the intention might be to avoid perceived bureaucracy, it bypasses established control mechanisms designed to prevent even the appearance of impropriety. This approach neglects the importance of objective evaluation and the potential for unconscious bias to influence decision-making, even when not intentionally sought. It undermines the robustness of Norsk Hydro's internal controls and exposes the company to risks associated with unfair procurement practices. Finally, an incorrect approach of discussing the personal relationship with the supplier to gauge their reaction before deciding whether to disclose would be highly inappropriate. This action not only fails to address the conflict of interest, but actively involves the external party in an internal ethical dilemma, potentially pressuring them or creating an awkward situation. It demonstrates a lack of understanding of the seriousness of conflicts of interest and the importance of maintaining a clear separation between personal relationships and professional responsibilities. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of Norsk Hydro's code of conduct and relevant Norwegian regulations regarding conflicts of interest. When a potential conflict is identified, the immediate step should be to consult internal policies and disclosure procedures. If uncertainty remains, seeking advice from a supervisor, legal counsel, or the compliance department is crucial. The overarching principle is to prioritize transparency, fairness, and the integrity of business processes above personal convenience or relationships.